If Utah wants to emerge victorious against BYU, what must they do? And what kind of recruiting implications does this game have? And also, just how is the in state recruiting battle playing out between Utah and BYU? We're talking it all on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen and view of the day. We are available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube, and part of the Locked On Podcast Network. If this is your first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in the YouTube comments, as well as on social media, where you can follow our show on X today. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. You can visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is JT Wistersill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to be joined by Jeff Hansen, who does a little bit of everything this time of year. High school football coverage, does a great job covering BYU for 24/7 Sports. And Jeff, when we're talking about this matchup between Utah and BYU, it's so exciting to have it back. Okay, I haven't talked about this too much this week, but isn't it still weird that this is like happening in the middle of November and not on rivalry weekend? It doesn't feel right to me. I know people are mad about the late kickoff time. That's on, I mean, as much as I'd love to say like, oh, that's just ESPN. That Utah didn't hold up there under the bargain, right? If Utah had been ranked at this point, BYU done what they did, then this would be a much higher profile matchup than getting the late night ESPN slot. But it is still a little bit of a bummer to me that, as I'm super excited to have this rivalry back, I did just want it on rivalry weekend, where I feel like it deserves to be played as one of the best rivalries in college sports.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's weird. Look, I think Brett Yormark's done a lot of really good things for the Big 12 since he took over. This one was a miss, and it's a small miss in the grand scheme of things. Nobody really cares, right? But like, look, if you're going to move your conference's marquee rivalry game off of rivalry weekend, then you do. It doesn't really matter what the team's records are. You do whatever you can to get it a premier spot. Because theoretically, that's why they moved it, right? So that, okay, BYU Utah doesn't have to compete with Michigan and Ohio State and, Auburn, Alabama, and all these other big rivalries. It can be the premier rivalry game of the week. But then it gets buried on ESPN. It feels weird. Feels like a miss from Yormark. Either make it a rivalry game on rivalry week with all that hoopla, or sell out to get good coverage. If you're going to move it away, he didn't really do either one of those. And so that, it feels weird to me.
It does feel weird, but like you mentioned, that is a minor gripe. What's most important is we do have this rivalry back. Can't wait for it to get underway. And as we go into this one, I thought it'd be fun for us to kind of, trade sides. We both know these teams so well. You're doing a great job covering BYU. I've talked about this Utah team, unfortunately, at length this season and meeting all of the low valleys that they've been in as of late. So we're going to talk about if Utah wins, if BYU wins, how would that play out? And I want to ask you, as someone who knows BYU's weaknesses and of course their strengths too, but like if Utah were to win this game, how did it happen? What played out?
Yeah, if Utah wins this game, I think it's going to be the way that Utah has won a lot of the close rivalry games over the last, decade, however long it's been. Seems like, as a BYU fan, you just expect Utah's defense to score in this game. It's what happens. And you expect special teams to set up a short field or to pin BYU back deep. You expect those non-offensive plays to dig a hole for BYU. And look, we can talk all day long about the things that Utah isn't this year, but there's still a lot of things that Utah is, and there's still a very good defense. It may not be quite what Utah fans are accustomed to seeing, but in the national scheme of things, your Utah's defense is still fantastic. The run defense is a little more suspect, kind of uncharacteristic, but overall, that's still a very good defense, a very opportunistic defense. And I sort of expect that they will turn BYU over once again. That is one area where Jake Retzlaff, he's certainly improved from where he was a year ago. He's worlds better than where a lot of BYU fans expected him to be this year. But he still has a few passes every game that you kind of grit your teeth and you clench because it's one of those turnover-worthy plays, right? So I expect Utah to come down with a couple of those. That's just what they do, right? And then Utah can still run the football really well. Mekhi Bernard is having a great year. That offensive line is still really, really good. And I think that's the formula. It's a throwback Utah game, right? Those early years of the Pac-12. You're not spreading it out and throwing it around to 100 tight ends or anything like that. It's really tough defense, make it gross football, and try to win 24-21. I think that's the recipe that Utah could follow and pick up a win in this game. BYU's offense has been good, but they're not scoring 60 points a game, right? And Utah's defense, while not what they're used to seeing, still very, very good. If they can score, set up some short fields, and leave the offense to come up with 2 touchdowns, yeah, I think absolutely that's the recipe for Utah to get a win. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, look, Kyle Whittingham, Morgan Scalley, they're going to have a game plan for BYU. There's no question about it.
Feels like if you're Utah, even though you're in your own building, you got to get to 20 points in order to win this game. And that is something, I mean, this 4-game losing stretch. I mean, Jeff, I'll have you guess. What do you think Utah has averaged over this 4-game losing streak?
Yeah, I know it's not great. I would probably say 13, 14 points a game.
There you go. It's 12. It was right around there. And unfortunately, even lower than you said, and obviously lower than all of our expectations were for this Utah squad. But yes, that's where this Utah team, they've only been able to muster that many points. So you're basically just hoping they can get 1 touchdown in each half on the offensive side of the ball. And then, like you said, I think you got to get the defensive touchdown if you're Utah. Is there a world where Mike Bajakian and this offense finally clicks, come together? We still don't know if it's going to be Brandon Rose or Issac Wilson, because, of course, it's quarterback controversy every single week with this dang Utah football program. But I think there's a world where they can have 2 successful touchdown drives. The things they've missed on, like if you look at some of the easy screen passes and just missed assignments, there are things like, okay, like I feel like it is reasonable to think that once each half, Utah can put together a scoring drive and then get their defense to score once. But it's reasonable. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. So that's where it's going to be incredibly hard for Utah to still beat one of the 10 best teams in college football. And you know what, Jeff, I want to give you a second to rant because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too. I still can't believe the love that like Notre Dame, and we're in the call now, the playoff rankings and everything will be out, but like, I can't believe how long Notre Dame has been put above BYU, and just how have you felt about the way that the national media has been, some slowly but surely coming around on the Cougars, and some just feels like really ignoring their success?
Yeah, look, I mean, I could talk about it from a BYU lens, but I think this includes Utah and Utah's future. I think it includes everybody in the Big 12, the ACC. We've gotten into this power rankings mode as a college football society where we look at things like betting lines and what the spreads are going to be, and that is what forms our opinions of how good a team is. And I think we're losing sight of what has a team done on the field. I mean, we're really hyper-focused on what the analytics say. I mean, I think everybody who can write a simple Python script pulls in some sort of data and analytics and then comes up with their own formula that they say, hey, this is the definitive way to gauge college football. And I think that it's not surprising. I actually wrote about it I think it was January of last year of, guys, there's some things that we're not prepared for, right? BYU, Big 12, all that stuff. This was to BYU fans. But just get used to it that, hey, look, a 3-loss Tennessee team is probably going to be talked about as a better team than whoever comes out of the Big 12. And at the time in January, it was like, yeah, if it's a 11-1 Utah team versus a 3-loss Tennessee team, I would bet that the national narrative is that 3-loss Tennessee team is better than a 1-loss Utah team. The names are different now that we're 10 months, 11 months removed from that article, but the principles are staying the same. Whether it's Notre Dame and a 1-loss Notre Dame, or whether it's Ohio State, it's a really good loss, right? It doesn't really change what the national narrative is. And you see it even play out just this last weekend while both BYU and Utah were sitting at home. Kansas State loses and Iowa State loses, and the narrative is that, oh my gosh, the Big 12 is a terrible league. This league just continues to beat each other up. What a bad football league. Texas A&M goes and loses to South Carolina by 3 touchdowns, and it's, wow, South Carolina is a really darn good football team. That's what happens in the SEC. Like the narrative, it's the same story, right? That, yeah, there's parity now across college football. The transfer portal and NIL and all of these things have taken the talent that used to be concentrated to 10, 12 teams and spread it out to 25 different teams, right? But the storylines haven't caught up to what the parity has, right? The parity is outpacing the storyline, and we're still looking at power rankings, logos on helmets, and that's how we're trying to decide who the best team in college football is, resumes are mattering less and less. And it's a problem. It's a problem for BYU this year. It's a problem even inside the Big Ten. Indiana is having to really try really hard to prove that, no, guys, we are the real deal. It's a problem across college football. It's not just everybody outside of the Big Ten and the SEC. It's even happening within those conferences as well.
I don't know how many times this week BYU and Utah fans are going to agree, but if we cannot find common ground on that fantastic take that you just had, Jeff, I'm going to give you a standing ovation if I didn't have to hold this microphone. That was perfectly said. And the very first team you brought up was Tennessee. That's really interesting because what happened to Tennessee? Tennessee lost to Arkansas. Well, that's SEC, Arkansas. I think it happened. Arkansas lost to Oklahoma State. Like, that's what we're doing here. And then it's like, oh, when it happens in the SEC, it's, oh, like you said, like, this team's good. Kentucky's not good. Georgia beat them by 1 point. Same thing with, they beat Mississippi State was hanging around with them. Florida's hanging around with them. Like, in these games, like, just because it's Georgia, and especially even last year, right? Like, they lost a lot of talent from these teams. We just continue to give that name on the helmet the benefit of the doubt. And that's where it really is unfortunate. And hopefully I'm very curious to see how everything ends up shaking out, just even when we get to the final rankings, right? Of like how we evaluate these teams with their complete resume. And it is really unfortunate the way that so much of this stuff is drawn up overall. So we talked about from Utah's perspective, how they would get a win and what kind of would be the recipe for success. Let's do the same then. If Utah was going to lose, what would we probably look at it from that point and what would be a BYU win? We're going to be breaking it down in one moment. All right, coming back in here with Jeff. First thing before we talk about a Utah loss, maybe I'm just delaying talking about that because it's a scary thing to think about with the way things have already gone bad this year. Don't want to lose to your rival on top of having maybe the most disappointing season in program history. Anyways, Jeff, I want to ask you about this. You mentioned the history of the rivalry, and that got the hamster running around on the wheel in my head turning. What do you think about the role that history will play in this game in particular? Because we do see that happen. We're like, oh, this year for Ryan Day, right? He's got to get a win against Michigan. History is part of it. These teams haven't seen each other in a couple years, though. What kind of a role do you think the historic sense, you talked about the picks, just the defensive touchdowns that Utah's gotten. How does what's happened in the past potentially impact this game?
Yeah, for fans, it's everything, right? I mean, fans, we live in the history that's, I'm a pretty superstitious guy. So all of that's going to come to the forefront for me. On the field, I don't think history has ever mattered less in this game. I mean, if you really look at it, most of the players, especially in the transfer portal era, right? Most of the players that are going to be playing on Saturday night haven't played one another. Like they haven't. There haven't been very many guys on BYU's team today that were on that team in 2021. And then these teams didn't play in 2020 because of COVID. So really, they've played twice since 2019. So on either side of the rivalry, on either sideline, there's not going to be more than a few handfuls of guys who have actually played in this game. From a coaching perspective, look, Kyle Whittingham, we all know he's at the end of his career, whether that's this year, next year, whenever it is, he's at the tail end of his career. He doesn't have to prove anything about BYU anymore. Like, he's proven what he can do against BYU. He's proven cemented his status within this rivalry. So he doesn't have to change history or rewrite a story, right? It's not a Ryan Day situation where he can't win the big game. It's different, right? So Whittingham doesn't have anything left to prove. For Sitake, he beat the streak, right? He ended the streak. That took a long time. That bought him a lot of goodwill from BYU fans in this rivalry. And of course, this year, right, even if BYU loses to Utah on Saturday night, that's going to suck. Nobody's going to want that in Provo. But it's like Utah in 2021. Utah lost to BYU. That was a bummer, but they still went on and won the Pac-12. And that loss to BYU, oh well, right? BYU can lose this game on Saturday, and they're still firmly in control and have a shot at a Big 12 conference title. So history, I don't think it really matters that much on the field. It's going to have a lot of storylines. There's all the history and friendships and all that stuff. So that's going to be talked about a ton. But in terms of overcoming the bugaboo and getting the monkey off your back, I think all of that's gone. I don't think there's a lot of that this year. And it's really the first time I think I've been able to say that in the last decade, right? For Utah, it was, hey, you've got to prove that you're the Pac-12 and this independent school. You got to prove stuff. And that kind of is gone now. And for Kalani, it was, hey, you got to prove that you could beat Utah. Nobody else has done it. It's been 10 years. Blah, blah. That's done too. There's not a lot of history left that needs to be proven on either side of the field on this one.
Such a great point. I think that, like you said, like Utah needs to get a win. They want to beat their rival, but it's not like by not beating BYU, it's like, oh, they've only lost to them twice in a row now, as we mentioned. Kyle Whittingham has been able to prove that. And like you said, for BYU, they were able to get over that hump a couple of years ago. So I agree. I don't think the history, once again, Ohio State, has to be, especially with the state of this Michigan team,
Right,
Ohio State has to beat Michigan. That's really not the case for either of those teams because, as you mentioned, all of BYU's goals will be in front of them. And for Utah, when you look back on the season, there will be a lot more disappointing losses than losing to top 10 ranked BYU at home. And speaking of Utah losing the game, I think I'll spin it for Utah's perspective. If Utah were to lose this game, I'm going to go what's been kind of the theme of the season. I think the quarterbacks will really struggle in this game. I think you'll see the offense is really one-dimensional. The running game Kyle Whittingham spoke about this earlier in the week in his press conference. He talked about the running game's maybe not been as good. And I think I agree with him, but there's been so many situations where Utah is in third and manageable because the running game does something and the pass game doesn't give you anything. And I feel like if Utah comes short, it's that. And I think the other thing that'll haunt Utah on this game especially is explosive plays. I mean, they've given up some of those 20-yard runs. There's been a couple of explosive pass plays through the air too. It's funny how frequently we've seen teams like Houston, TCU, and BYU's offense is better than both those teams, but they'll get into the red zone and that's where Utah will stand up, but they have given up way too many big plays. And I feel like that's where this Utah team could really get themselves in trouble if they're not getting anything going through the air. And sure that we look at overall and it's like, oh, their defense only held them to this many yards. And it's like, yep, but they let up that one big play and that's what really cost them.
Yeah, I think I agree. And from the BYU perspective, if I'm looking at Utah on tape, I'm saying, hey, BYU's run game with a healthy LJ Martin and a healthy Hinckley Ropati, I think that BYU has to get that ground game. They got to look to exploit that. I don't know what's happened because the talent is certainly there at Utah, but the run game just isn't. The run defense isn't playing well. They're just not. And so I think that's an area that BYU is going to try to establish early. It's been really weird. I think is it 4 games in a row? I think it was 3 games in a row that Jake Retzlaff threw for exactly 218 yards. And then he broke that streak against UCF and threw for 220. I mean, it's been really weird how they're almost exactly.
Oh yeah, you're right. He did throw for 218 3 games in a row. I'm looking at it right now. That is wild.
Yeah, it's super weird. And then UCF wasn't. I mean, he wasn't 218, but it was right there in that same ballpark. It's bizarre. I don't really understand it, but BYU has been really 50-50 in terms of their play calling distribution, what the actual production has been against UCF. And that's not a great run defense. It's not a terrible run defense, but it hasn't been a great run defense. BYU finally got multiple running backs going. Jake Retzlaff had been leading the team in rushing because they just went through so many running backs. There was 4 weeks in a row to start the season. It was a different guy who was the leading rusher for BYU. Everybody's healthy right now. BYU is going to have to try to take advantage of whatever holes for whatever reason that they're there. BYU's got to try to take advantage of those and then let Jake Retzlaff find those 1 or 2 big plays. If they can do that, I don't think that they can get into a shootout. If somehow this Utah offense comes out firing and BYU's got to hang 30, 40 points, I don't know that this offense can do that against this defense. But if they can keep that Utah offense where Utah's offense has been, yeah, I think that this offense can gain enough momentum on the ground, find a few big plays, and find the end zone, 3 or 4 times. I think that's what BYU's recipe has to be for a win.
Agreed. I still can't believe, Jeff, also, as we sit here talking about it, I remember going into this year and I viewed this game as just the complete opposite, as Kyle Whittingham said, right? Yeah. This was supposed to be BYU comes in. What was the over under win? Was it 4.5? The win total?
4.5. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I mean. So literally at 4, if you guys were 4-4 right now, BYU, it'd be like, oh, we're on pace we got 2 games left. We're probably going to get bowl eligible. We'll figure out from there. And now it's it literally is completely flipped. And now we are saying, unless things drastically change for Utah, they're not going to get bowl eligible. And what was supposed to be this historic season, Utah's excited to have this game at home, but man, that home field advantage, it just isn't what it used to be. And I'm not from the fan perspective, just the fact that the team has not played well at home this season. Unfortunately, with you look at some of the really recent and disappointing losses. I mean, okay, Jeff, coming into the year on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident were you in this BYU's team's ability to win in Salt Lake versus where you're at with that now?
Yeah, so I generally rate the toughest games in the preseason.
Mhm.
I think I had Utah at number 2. I think the cross-country trip at UCF, I thought they would be much better than they are.
Yes.
In 2 time zones, all that stuff. I thought that would
Mhm.
be BYU's toughest game, followed very closely by Utah. And I'll be honest with you, JT, I still think this game is going to be really tough for BYU. I
Mhm.
just think that the way that this matchup is, where it isn't, BYU has beaten, look at the teams they've beaten: Arizona, Oklahoma State, UCF. These are teams that have been kind of in disarray.
Mhm.
Utah's in disarray for entirely different reasons, right? Utah's defense is still very, very good.
Mhm.
And while I am really encouraged by what I've seen from BYU's offense, they still aren't scoring 45, 50 points a game, right? I mean, it's been in the 30s
Mhm.
and they're getting some fortuitous turnovers, right?
True.
It's not fluky. It's not things like, I mean, they're doing it
Mhm.
every week at this point. So it is repeatable and all that stuff, but it's different, right? I mean, a really good defense can slow this offense down. And I still think this is going to be a tough game. It comes down to me, the first quarter, right? That, like,
Mhm.
how motivated is Utah really? They're all
Mhm.
going to say the right things. They're going to come into the game with a lot of momentum and a lot of fire and passion because it's football. It's still college football, no matter how good or bad your team is. But if Utah falls down 14-0 in the first quarter,
Mhm.
are they going to quit? Are they going to fold up? Do all of the last 4 games come, the forefront of their minds, and then they give up, right? Or are they able to hang and, hey, halftime it's still close, and then you get into the third quarter and it's still close, and the longer this game goes that it's close, the more and more confident the Utah is going to be. And at the end of the day, this team still does have a lot of talent. So if you give that talent some confidence, this game still scares me plenty as a BYU fan, even with the way that the script of the season has played out.
I expect it to be close to, and it's going to be really fun to see how it does all play out. And one thing that's not on the line in this game, not just bragging rights, recruiting implications. Jeff, you do a great job with 24/7 Sports covering all things BYU recruiting. I want to talk about the recruiting implications in this one for both Utah and BYU, especially in state, in one moment. All right, back in with Jeff. And Jeff, recruiting implications. Before we talk about the future, let's talk about the present. 2 massive gets for BYU. Austin Pay, who it was kind of weird, him and Utah just never really seemed to click throughout all of the recruiting process. Honestly, I don't remember him ever really seeming like Utah was high on his list. And then another guy who was incredibly productive a couple years ago in Jeff.
Yeah, Alai Kalani.
That's why you're the
Yeah.
best. Now that he went out down to Bishop Gorman, he decided he was going to go to Oregon. He's flipping and coming to BYU. You look at Utah, what one of the things they were really excited about was getting Caleb Lomu and Spencer Fano, and they've been an awesome tackle tandem for Utah. And now BYU's got their own in the class of 2025. And really the last 2 years, it feels like BYU's picked up a lot of steam in the recruiting in state, especially.
Yeah, man, it's been interesting to see, and it's especially this year. It's actually something I asked Kalani about last signing day. So let's
Mhm.
paint the picture, right? They just wrapped up a really disappointing 5-7 season. They lost 5 straight games, and then they go into signing day and they have a good signing day. It's one of the better BYU classes, but still a far cry from where they need to be in order to compete in the Big 12. And I talked to Kalani that day, and he told us that he believed that eventually, in this era of college football, that locker room culture is going to be a competitive advantage.
Mhm.
And at the time in December, because what other positive things are you going to talk about, right?
Yeah.
I didn't put a whole lot of stock into it. That felt like coach speak in every sense of the word. Now we're here in November, and I look at the top 25, and I see teams like Indiana, and I see teams like Iowa State,
Mhm.
BYU, Army, Navy. There's a bunch of teams in there that aren't your traditional powerhouses. And yet here they are in November. A lot of those teams are undefeated still. 3 of them are still undefeated. That's kind of crazy to me. So I went back and I started to really hone in on what was Kalani talking about, this culture being a competitive advantage. And I think that's it for BYU. Right now, they have guys. Look, BYU is already different, right? They're the honor code, all this stuff that everybody knows about BYU. Guys are making a certain sacrifice of whether it be a college lifestyle or whether it be going above and beyond with academics, whatever it is. They're
Mhm.
making some level of sacrifice in order to play at BYU. And I think that helps Kalani set a culture because everybody else in the country right now, transfer portal, Palooza, NIL, you're playing for money and things like that. And I think you're seeing a lot of coaches who have historically been very, very good at creating a locker room culture struggle because, look at Nick Saban, right? Nick Saban left, the game kind of passed him by, and he wasn't really shy about that, of saying, hey, it's changed. It used to be in Nick Saban's heyday, if a guy wanted to make money playing football, he had to come and do everything that Nick Saban said. And if he did, good chance he was going to go to the NFL. But now you can make money playing football anywhere. And if that's your primary motive, then it's going to be really difficult, right? To create that culture. But BYU has a little bit of an advantage there, I think, because you've already got guys that are setting aside other stuff in order to play at BYU. I think that helps a school like BYU. It helps Kalani set that culture. I think it helps Army. I think it helps Navy, right? You look at some of these schools that are playing for something different than just money. I think it helps create that culture. So what does that mean for recruiting? I think as BYU finds guys that are willing to set those other things aside, whatever it is, I think that they buy into BYU a little bit differently than maybe they would have 10 years ago, right? Because they truly are buying into BYU. If you look at what BYU has done, well, I guess what has happened to BYU in the transfer portal over the last few years, there's been Logan Fano. There's been a handful of guys in every class that hurt to lose. But by and large, BYU's been able to keep their core together. Kalani has kept that roster intact for the most part, year over year, for the 3-4 years that we've had the transfer portal now. I think that's the difference. And now BYU seeing the results in the win-loss column. And I think that some of these recruits are looking at that and saying, hey, winning is still fun. I'll make money. I'll do whatever. They can find other ways to succeed. BYU's always tried to pitch that they're more than just football. It's you're commit to BYU, you get all of these things, not just a football program. And as they lean into that more and they find guys that are willing to hear them out and they buy into that, I think I do think it has become a little bit of a competitive advantage for BYU. That's not everything. Talent still matters, all that good stuff, right? Like all of that stuff still stays the same. But there's another variable in this transfer portal era, and it is that culture, that locker room culture. And I think that is where BYU is starting to really find what their niche is on the recruiting trail.
Well, and we're talking about right now, Utah's culture is struggling. So I think that's kind of interesting how those two things can coincide when you look at the success BYU has had with a lot of the guys they've been able to find in-state as well, recruit, grow, and develop. And they're continuing to hit on some of those guys in the recruiting trail. Utah's got some of them. Probably got outbid on the Jerome Miles and the Aaron Dunns of the world and other scenarios too. So it's a total new recruiting world, and it's fascinating to see too how the results of this game, because it's just an extra recruiting tool, right? To be like, hey, oh, you're looking at Utah. Oh, we either school who does it right. We'll be like, oh, well, we just beat them by however much, and the bragging rights that go in there. It's going to be fascinating to see how the recruiting implications grow going forward with these programs and how it's impacted by this game. And we are nearly to kickoff of Utah and BYU getting underway. But Jeff, before we do get underway, please let everyone know where they can head over and check out your stuff.
Check us out. We're at CougarSportsInsider.com over on 24/7 Sports. Follow me on Twitter. You don't want to. I don't know that any Utah fan's going to want to follow me on Twitter over the next 7 days. But hey, if you do, by all means, come find me there.
Jeff, you're the best. Thanks for stopping by. That's going to do it for today's Locked On Utes. Appreciate Jeff again. And thank you for making us your first listen of the day, everyone. Hope you enjoy your afternoon.